Thank you all for coming to this session on basic income and employment. We have two speakers this afternoon. I'll time them at 15 minutes, and that should give us quite a bit of time for discussion afterwards. Our first speaker is going to be Larry Udell from Westchester University, speaking on some Rawlsian notes on universal basic income.
Don't applaud yet. Let's see. Okay, yes. Or, as I call it, taking, I should use this, huh? I'm going to walk around. Is it on?
Once you click it on, it'll come up.
Where do I click? Or, as I call it, taking employment seriously. So, as a little preface, I'm going to say that the choice between basic income and full employment is a false choice. It's a false dichotomy. It has to be basic income and full employment in order to have a just society, because there's no injustice greater than involuntary unemployment. And so the whole idea in John Rawls's view was that you shouldn't have involuntary unemployment and that people should be able to work. But this whole problem got framed differently because of a debate that Rawls had with Philippe von Parijs. Some of you may know the name. He, in philosophy, is the main advocate for basic income. His 2017 book, Basic Income, I forget exactly the subtitle, is a really outstanding presentation of all the different ins and outs on most issues except for the employment issue, I think. And so this goes back to a meeting that they had in a Paris taxi cab in 1987, where von Parijs, who had just been reading Rawls and really admired Rawls's theory of justice, in fact sort of made it his own, but he believed that Rawls would be very favorably disposed, given his difference principle, which takes into account the interests of, to use Rawls's words, the least advantaged members of society, that a basic income would be an important way to secure the interests of the least advantaged members of society. And he proposed it to Philippe, and Rawls responds no, because of what's become a rather famous example, the Malibu surfer problem. Rawls said that he didn't think society should support people who just wanted to spend their lives surfing off the coast of Malibu. Some of you who are old enough may know that back in those days surfing was a big thing. It was in all the popular musics. We even had music. We had a group, the Beach Boys, and groups like Jan and Dean, and I think this is sort of where a lot of people, certainly where Rawls's consciousness was. So von Parijs responded to that with a couple of articles, one called Should Surfers Be Fed?, which is in the journal Philosophy and Public Affairs, another called Difference Principles, Rawls's famous principle for the least advantaged, he called, somewhat curiously, the difference principle, and von Parijs said difference principles, meaning that his difference principle supported basic income as opposed to Rawls's rejection of it. But in fact, my research I argue that this was a problem because Rawls was not clear about his view about employment. And von Parijs, who was unaware of Rawls's view of unemployment, didn't realize that Rawls thought people should be guaranteed jobs. And that was the point Rawls was making, was that the economy was badly structured, so you had unemployed people, and the way to take account of the interests of unemployed people was to make sure that the economy is structured in such a way that people can find jobs. And so, as I said at the outset, my claim is it's not basic income or full employment. It's basic income and full employment. So I'll spell this idea out a bit more and then we can talk about it. So here's the way I propose to amend Rawls's theory. He doesn't have anything in the theory about employment or full employment, but he did say only at the end of his life. In his 5 reforms needed in the United States, he listed among them, along with education, healthcare, elimination of sexism, also some form of guaranteed and socially useful work. But he didn't say this in his famous book. He only said it at the end of his life. And so Rawls simply assumed that we would want to have full employment, that a just society would involve full employment. Writing as he wrote the book in the 50s and 60s. It was published in 1971. He was working against a background where economists had fiscal and monetary policies in place that they hoped would do exactly what Rawls wanted with respect to employment, so he didn't feel a need to include it in the book. But I argue, he died in 2002. If he lived until 2008, he might have wanted to amend that theory and accept the amendment I'm proposing as a friendly amendment. Because you see, if you recognize employment as a primary good, and you're concerned about the interests of the least advantaged members of society, you want to make sure that people have an opportunity to find a meaningful job. Let me just say a job, meaningful hopefully, but at least a job. So that, because it's a feature of a fair system of social cooperation. This is Rawls's phrase for describing in a few extra words what a just society should be. We should think of society as a fair system of social cooperation, a good society. But if you assume full employment, then it doesn't come into the theory as essential to justice. The only economic primary good, and this is why Philippe thought Rawls would respond to his basic income proposal, because in Rawls's theory, the only primary good that's economic primary good is what he calls income and wealth, or I should say goods, because they're not quite the same thing. So he just left it to this, yes?
The mic be turned down a little, or can you like take it away a little?
Yeah, I'm talking too loud.
Thank you.
Is this better? Can I just talk like this?
No, you'll strain your voice, use the mic.
Okay.
Hopefully you can tone it down.
So he has one sentence in the book where he said, and it's in the middle of a 500-page book, so lots of people never read this sentence. In fact, I was talking to a Nobel economist who was a close friend of Rawls's who never found this sentence in the book. I'll talk about him a bit later. Reasonably full employment. The stabilization branch will provide reasonably full employment, he said, in the sense that those who wish to work can find it. This was Rawls's view. But in market economies, specifically with a labor market, where jobs are allocated by a labor market, there's typically a scarcity of jobs relative to the demand for jobs, and so there's typically involuntary unemployment, and if that's a problem, then you have to model full employment as essential for justice, and the only way you can do that in Rawls's theory, I won't get into the details of the argument, is to include employment as a primary good. So, his conception of reasonably full employment, this goes against the grain of what a number of people said yesterday about employment. Does not imply a work requirement. Therefore, it does not deny that there could be a basic income. It says reasonably full employment in the sense that those who wish to work can find it. So, since in an actual economy, as I noted, likely to fall short of that, we still require a basic income to cover both disabilities as well as involuntary unemployment, frictional unemployment when people are between jobs and whatnot. So the two really go together. And while Rawls himself didn't see the importance of arguing in this way, the fact remains that only the Malibu surfer, the free rider problem, people are going to not work because they don't have to work, and so they'll just be living off of the work of other people. This is a concern, but that's not the main problem. Rawls never thought that this was the main problem. They just got into this discussion and it sort of took off. I think we all know that when you're discussing something and you get off to a bad start, you don't usually get back on track. People end up talking past each other. And I think that's what happened here. Okay, good. So, sadly, the surfer problem was a red herring that took things off on the wrong track and might have been avoided if Rawls had been clear about the role of full employment in his theory at the outset, meaning when he published the book in 1971. So, quickly, because I have to be, feasibility. First of all, we have to stop talking about economics and treating these things as technical problems. We're talking here about political economy. And in 1815, David Ricardo, in his Principles of Political Economy, started out by characterizing the field thus: the produce of the earth, all that's derived from its surface by the united application of labor, machinery, and capital, is divided among the three capital classes of society. To determine the laws which regulate this distribution is the principal problem in political economy. You can't have full employment unless you change the distribution of income. That means taxation. Sorry, we're not getting full employment by just floating loans and running up deficits. There has to be a tax structure to support it. And a few people who are working on this, if you'd like to take a look at some things, these are major figures in economics. Edmund Phelps, Nobel laureate, has a book, Rewarding Work. Rawls loved this book. Rewarding Work, How to Restore Participation and Self-Support to Free Enterprise. That would be a good idea. Mass Flourishing, I'm reading it now. How Grassroots Innovation Created Jobs, Challenge, and Change. I'm just recommending reads for you here. Bob Solow, one of the most important economists of the 20th century, gave a Tanner lecture in 1997 about welfare and work, talking about how people on welfare don't like being on welfare. Maybe people with a basic income wouldn't be satisfied with the basic income. People want to contribute to society and feel like they're contributing as well as taking, and we have to give them that opportunity. And another essay, Piketty Was Right. I hope some people in the room know who Thomas Piketty is. Capital in the 21st Century is his book. It's a must-read, really. You can't read the whole thing, it's too long. You don't have to read the whole thing. I haven't read the whole thing. And a very important essay by Michael Kalecki, a Marxist who was at Cambridge in the 1930s and was working alongside of Keynes, and in 1943 published a paper, Political Aspects of Full Employment, where he said, of course we could have full employment, but the capitalist class is not going to like this, because when you drive up the demand for labor, you drive up wages, and full employment, therefore, is a bad thing. And so even though it could work, we're going to face opposition from it, which takes us back to Ricardo. I'm done.
And our next speaker will be Roberto Merrill from the University of Minho in Portugal. And his talk is on UBI, employment, and experiments.
I'm sorry about the title being so general. This is my first...
Wait, could you use the mic?
This is my first... Yeah. So, I'm a basic income activist in Portugal. So I spend a lot of time having debates, public debates, defending basic income with left-wing people, right-wing people, not so Marxists, Trotskyists, and all that. They're fully against it. So, but I also try to produce some academic knowledge. I'm a professor of philosophy and a researcher. And I just finished a book on basic income, but for the large public, with actually Sara, my colleague from Portugal, and two other colleagues. But this is the first time I'm trying to engage into the literature for and against basic income at an academic high level, I would say, because I think it's a good moment to do it. Mike gave a very interesting talk in that direction yesterday when he commented Lucas Tansky and the other guys. Gurevich. I haven't read this one. And I will try to do this with a couple other political philosophers, they are Rawlsians actually. So I'll start by a very brief introduction about the state as employer of last resort versus UBI as two left-wing alternatives to why not the problem of automation. But although I don't believe much that automation will be a problem, but I'll just take it as it might be a problem. So we have to find solutions, and the two most interesting solutions should be these two. Then I'm going to spell out some arguments in favor of the state as employer of last resort. And then I'll start criticizing it by using an argument by a philosopher called Stuart White from Oxford, who wrote an article saying that, state as an employer of last resort might be on normative grounds more justified than UBI, but the real world is so unfair that we shouldn't go for that, and we should try UBI. I'll explain that argument. And then my own contribution would be part 4, and this is something. I think it's a good moment now to try to engage with very interesting political philosophers who are not totally hostile against basic income, but they are Rawlsians, and so they have many normative arguments against basic income. And I think we should use the moment to try to force them to be more social scientists and look into the basic income experiments. And this is basically what I will try to do with this argument. And I won't talk about the last part, it's too long, but it would be to take some lessons from Carl's latest book on basic income experiments, which is an excellent book. So we can learn how to spin the results about basic income experiments. So the situation is, we're going to have technological unemployment. If it's inevitable, what can we do? Political philosophy has 2 replies, which then transform into 2 concrete public policies. From the Van Parigian side, we have a defense of UBI as a way to realize real freedom. And from the Rawlsian side, we would have this state as employer of last resort as a way to realize his theory of justice as fairness. And in fact, I join you when you say we should look at them as complementary, although I don't know which would be the best argument. But then we shouldn't look at them as necessarily opposed, that's for sure. So the arguments in favor of the state as an employer, which I read recently, were in the works of these 2 political philosophers and law scholars. So William Edmondson wrote a very interesting book where he tries to show that John Rawls was actually a socialist, which means, the means of production are public, belong to everyone. So this is a very, he's really taking Rawls to the left, and there was an article in the journal Jacobin quite favorable to this effort. And then I invited him for a summer school, and so we're just going to publish this month a symposium on the book. And I wrote a little article criticizing his critique of basic income, Rawlsian critique, and he replied, so I'm trying to engage in that way. And then Alan Thomas wrote an excellent Rawlsian book defending property-only democracy as a, a system, a very equalizing system, almost a socialist political system. And he just wrote an article. I think you read it because he thanks you in his article. Yeah? Okay. Did you not? Well, he thanks you. Yeah. So these are the arguments he uses against, for the state as an employer. He says that it's better to have the state as employer better than a UBI because it empowers individuals by engaging them in the labor market. Second argument, it challenges the dominating market power of the rentier class. And third argument, it is an expression of reciprocity and the fair value of political liberties. So the two first arguments are more empirical, and the third one is the one about the reciprocity, is more normative. And so here when these people defend full employment, they're not defending full employment at any price. It must be meaningful, well-paid employment. So we should be careful, we advocates of basic income, not to make a caricature out of what they are defending. We should attack the best possible defense of full employment, which is a very pleasant thing actually, because you do good things, interesting things for a good salary. That's the whole idea. Maybe not in the real world, but at least in theory, that's the propose. And so this is so radical in its positive conception that he writes, don't fit the citizen to the job, fit the job to the citizen with the skill set that they actually have. So this is a very generous conception of the state as an employer. To the point that the focus on education and retraining in the absence of a commitment to full employment redistributes unemployment and devalues the skills premium. So the first objection from this point of view to UBI is that the working poor will leave the labor market. He believes that under a UBI, the incentive to introduce more leisure into the economy is accompanied with a financial incentive to make use of it. And with a UBI, could a significant number of those currently on the labor market, especially the poor who are working poor, would withdraw from it. So, yeah, well, he's right to raise this issue, but it's so theoretical. And this is not the strongest argument. Of course, if this happens, then we should think about another solution than a UBI. But this is where I think we should use something that we have in our favor, which is the boiling new literature on basic income experiments. We can think they're really bad. I mean, there's not a single good enough basic experiment in the world, but at least we have them, and we can use this empirical evidence to fight back these arguments. The second objection is about inflation. I'll pass it because I was surprised to see that he really believed it's a possibility. For me, it's an objection that we shouldn't take too seriously. But again, it relies on the premise that the working poor will not work. And again, if we look at the results of basic income experiments from the 60s on, people don't stop working. So the whole argument rests on a premise which is not empirical, which is not evidence-based. So the second argument against UBI, the second argument for state employment is that it challenges the dominating market power of the wealthiest people. So he writes, it is the rentier class engaged in a struggle with entrepreneurs over the division of the surplus, who do not want the state to put a floor on their employment because that would politically strengthening the working class in the distributional struggle. So for him, full employment, yeah, I know. Full employment is something that is much more radical than a UBI to resist the economic and political power of the wealthiest. So I won't go through this. Finally, the normative argument that he uses for the state as an employer is, of course, that this is an expression of the reciprocity and the fair value of political liberties, which is a concept that is quite clearly defended in Rawls. This is why Rawls is against UBI, because he would not respect the fair terms of social cooperation. So those who choose to share in the benefits created by others' productive efforts should make a reciprocal effort in return. And this implies that it is not exploitative, there are no free riders. So conditionality is then defended as a means of encouraging reciprocity. It's nothing to do with paternalism or, it's really something, it's a political value, not a moralist value. So he says that the real contrast between the way in which a UBI leads to inflation that negates most of its good effects for the worst off, and a Rawlsian proposal widely to disperse capital, to ensure fair access to it, and to aim at reasonable equity in its distribution. So the question is, if we deny the premise that he implies is true, if a UBI does not lead to inflation, then why should we prefer state employment on normative grounds? The main reason is because of the value of reciprocity. So this is the real argument behind. And my strategy is to say, okay, it's completely opposed strategy to Larry. Larry says, no, reciprocity is compatible with UBI. That was more or less his position. And I will say, my position is to say, okay, they win. I'm not going to debate with the Rawlsians about reciprocity. They win theoretically. They have excellent arguments against UBI on that grounds. But, so one little extra point. Rawlsians are not, if you don't want to work with the state employment, you can also do a civic minimum. We talked about that yesterday, about participation income. So the two things, the point is that there's conditionality in both. And then conditionality is essential for reciprocity. But so I can accept the reciprocity is incompatible with UBI. I'll just take it like that. But I would say that since the real world, we cannot have fair reciprocity because those that are the least advantaged, the worst off, are in such bad conditions that we can never offer them pleasant jobs, well-paid, meaningful, etc., etc. It will always be bad, stupid jobs with bad salaries that the state can offer. So in these conditions, we should opt for a UBI alternative. And this position, which I consider very subtle, is defended by Stuart White. So you say, okay, we lose theoretically, but empirically, UBI wins. And so my own contribution would be that's the last thing I would like to say. To look into the literature about, experiments in Finland, in Utrecht, and in a few other Holland countries, Holland towns, and also in Barcelona, and, try to take the argument into empirical grounds and see how they react, because they won't be able to use hypothetical arguments about inflation, etc. So this would be the strategy. It is true that, for example, in Barcelona, last seconds, the latest results, which are not public yet, but I had access to them 2 weeks ago, show that the people in the group which receives a cash but conditional to participation, these people are happier than those who receive a basic income unconditionally. So that's, it's tricky. And, we have to understand why, because these are people that they're extremely loneliness in relations. So for the first time of their lives, people are getting interested in what they want to do with their lives. So it makes sense that they are happier, which means that we need basic income experiments which apply to people who are already employed, etc. It would be a long discussion, but I just wanted to give you the general direction of the arguments, which is still a very rough draft. Thank you.
Okay, so we now have about half an hour for discussion. I'll come around with the microphone, so people want to raise their hands, comments from, start with, maybe we'll take a couple of questions and then start over here. You want to, okay, so the two back there.
Actually.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. With regard to this, I don't think I have it on. Here we go. It doesn't seem to be working.
Oh, is it working now? Thank you. With regard to the definition of work and employment, with regard to Larry particularly, and in terms of the old industrial concept of markets and markets, ownership, employment. In my readings on things around Piketty, I'm sorry, it's not my main area of interest in life, but it seems that particularly from the post-feminist period, that the definition of work and the definition of satisfaction for work has broadened beyond the concept of participating in a traditional industrial market. And I also, so that concerns me in terms of, I've got a question that I'm going to be asking, but I also want to say that what seems to be proposed is what China did in the 60s, which was basically the iron rice bowl, and which in fact they're bringing back from forcing people to work on farms, because it is socially productive to have people engaging socially with each other in employment. But particularly post-feminist, we recognize that work and employment, what we call now emotional labor, also contributes to the GNP. And when we're looking at basic income guarantee, it's not a replacement for market wages or market labor. It's basically social security. So in terms of looking at it as social security, how would that impact on your concern about the fact that it would impact, that there would be concern that people would be wanting to work or this or that other thing? It basically will go for rent and a little bit of food. It's not designed to disrupt the market economy. Can I have your comments, please?
Sure. Sure. So I'm not trying to address every problem related to employment or every question related to employment. I'm working within the concept of a market economy, which means that we're talking about jobs that pay money. And this is one reason why the issue that you're raising is an important one, and why I do see basic income and Rawlsian full employment as I'm articulating it and Rawls did going together. And so you're suggesting that there are ways people can be productive outside of the labor market, and I'm saying I agree with that. But at the same time, the labor market is a huge problem in our society. And so if a person wants to work, then they should be able to work. And by the way, as a society, if we take this seriously, we have to restructure a lot of things. One thing would be childcare, if a woman does want to work. So if she doesn't want to work, she should have a basic income so she can raise her child. Maybe she's in a partnership.
Or he, because it's
or
his
he,
child.
absolutely, or he, yes. Or even shared,
Yeah.
so that they're each working. But the fact is that the labor market has to allow for that if we're going to have something like that.
Thank you, Larry.
back there was, he had his hand up first.
So you tell me how to take the mic. That's your job. All right.
Thank you. This is a question for Roberto. I'm very sympathetic to your project and also interested in responding to left critiques of basic income, and I think there is kind of fruitful ground there. I'm wondering if you think the following distinction might possibly be useful in trying to convince someone like Stuart White. So I wonder if you could make a distinction between seeing something as morally conditional yet politically unconditional at the same time. And here's an example. So let's say there's two friends, for instance, and one person is frequently buying coffee for the other. They're always going out for coffee, and it's one person. They're both like in equal social positions, but one person is always buying coffee. We seem to recognize, look, there's something kind of wrong here. There's a kind of failure of reciprocity in that. So we tend to think, no, look, we should equally kind of go back and forth. That's what tends to happen in these kind of awkward coffee relationships. Where you're kind of, should I pay this time, and then the next time the other person pays. So we tend to think, look, there's a kind of moral responsibility there that I should, return the favor. But we don't then make the judgment that you should be politically obliged to in the way that, that you should be like that I can, call the police and say, hey, my friend's not paying for coffee. So, so we recognize, look, there's some things that are morally conditional that should still be politically unconditional, because that's just not something that's appropriately within the purview of the state to enforce. And so I wonder if you can think about basic income that way. And this is my problem with White's view of fair reciprocity, is I think there's a kind of failure to make that distinction. So I wonder if you could still recognize, look, if I'm receiving basic income, I maybe have moral obligations to do things to, help people in my community, other things, my family or others, while still recognizing maybe it could be administered in a politically unconditional fashion. And I wonder, do you think that distinction would be convincing to people of this sort of Rawlsian bent?
Well, first thing is that Stuart White has changed his mind.
We need the mic, sorry, if you could
Yeah.
kindly.
This article I cited by Stuart White, he is in favor of basic income. So he changed his mind since his Republican position, right?
Okay, yeah.
So the thing is that you are trying to see reciprocity in a way which would be compatible with receiving an unconditional cash grant, right? And can you rephrase the argument again? Because I didn't understand it. It looks interesting, but I think I missed the premise somewhere. Did you?
I think that the core premise is that you could have that thinking that something is morally conditional does not entail that something should be politically conditional.
Mm-hmm. And so?
So I can appreciate that receiving benefits from the state might place a moral obligation on me to behave in certain ways,
Mm-hmm.
without necessarily recognizing that entails that I should be politically forced to do certain sorts of things.
So, for example, you would be forced to do some things like working, but with a moral justification instead of a political justification to receive a basic income, right? Or would it be
Well, sorry, I take it. Sorry, I'll say this, but if it's maybe we can talk about this after.
Yeah, it looks.
But I think my basic idea is I think people want to sort of say that we should have some kind of participation income or conditional sort of assistance because there's this fear that people are going to abuse this reciprocity. There's going to be a failure of reciprocity. And
of political reciprocity.
Of political
right?
reciprocity, but I think it's really ultimately a moral objection that if I give money to someone receives money, that they have some obligation, but then people move from that sort of moral obligation to the political thing, saying that look, there should be these political conditions attached. You have to like Atkinson test, participation test, that you have to fulfill some sort of test that you have done this. But this I think is beyond the competency of the state to administer. That the state doesn't have a meaningful way to determine what counts as a contribution or not. So you could still recognize that, hey, I should contribute in some way, but it's beyond the capacity of the state to actually determine what counts as a contribution.
So what's doing the argument is the capacity of the state That's the real, the work.
That would be another core premise. So the first is
Yeah.
that there isn't a necessary connection between moral and political.
Yeah, but that doesn't seem enough to.
Sure.
Excuse me, this might, Larry wanted to get something in on this,
Okay,
and
I'm
then
happy
maybe
to
we
just
could,
leave this, yeah.
it might be a
The view you're articulating is Philippe Von Paris's view. He doesn't put it that way,
Okay.
but Von Paris in Basic Income acknowledges that the surfer is a problem. That is, the Malibu surfer is morally corrupt in taking an income and not contributing anything. But we should still give him the money, politically.
I think we next had Jim. Did you still have a question? And then the woman in the back. So we have those next three questions.
Okay, thanks for the presentations. They're very interesting. As you might have picked up yesterday during the session on the left and basic income, I'm very skeptical about the notion of quote-unquote full employment. I mean, there's the ecological argument that would take us down the path towards an even more ecologically unsustainable economy. But put that aside for a moment. I mean, just going back to the sort of Keynesian notion of full employment economy and what the Keynesian welfare states, many of them, aspired to in the 3 decades after World War II. I mean, I don't think none of them achieved it. I mean, there were periods, recessions, periods of high unemployment, structural unemployment, the inability of women to find meaningful, well-paid work. So I think, even in Keynesian terms, we never achieved it. So is it sort of time to give up on that whole notion? And I guess the other thing is a pragmatic thing, like, how would it work? Like, how would everybody get a job provided to them if they wanted one? The state as employer of last resort, how would that work without turning into some sort of Stalinist central command kind of economy? I just don't think the paradigm makes sense anymore, to be blunt.
Yeah.
I think all of those objections are answerable and actually fairly easily. First of all, on the sustainability question, we don't have to employ people in jobs where they're putting carbon into the atmosphere. We can employ people to do other things than those jobs. So yeah, we have a big problem with carbon and we definitely need to do something about it. But if anything, it points to using less carbon-creating technology and maybe in some cases more human labor, even though in financial terms it may appear inefficient because of the fact that we don't take account of carbon costs in our economy. So that's not an issue to me at all. On the Keynesian thing, this was a missed opportunity. In 1945, I meant to mention this in my talk, but I didn't have time. 1945, the United States Congress considered a full employment act, which would have extended the WPA as a permanent program, and it didn't pass. So the next year in 1946, we got the Employment Act, without the word full, of 1946, which created the Council of Economic Advisors, welfare, and taking the cheap way out, instead of giving people jobs and paying them decent incomes, which would have required a hugely, and to this day will certainly require a hugely reconstructed tax structure. And I just don't understand what's the problem with saying that people should have an opportunity to contribute to society if they want to. And we ought to find a way to do that. So for your third question, I'm working on that. Or I should say, we need to be working on that.
Just a little note to your comment. I agree pragmatically it must be a nightmare, but that's what Sanders and Alessandria are going to propose again. So we're going to live through that again.
Yeah.
So I share Jim's concerns, but furthermore, I'm a bit confused. I think that maybe we're headed into a trap. I try to have it both ways with the unconditional guarantee and the guaranteed jobs. If the surfer doesn't want to work and gets the money, because you did mention that we're still in a voluntary environment, and his neighbor or his brother wants a job, but hey, to work, I'm not going to be happy with the same amount of money. I'm going to want more money. And then next thing you know, it's a jobs program. And who determines, the argument on the other side would be, well, what makes my participation, the things that the work that I do, that's not compensated because I'm getting this unconditional guarantee, what makes his job that was manufactured for whatever, to make him feel good or, you know, more productive, what makes one better than the other, and why should I get the same amount that he does, et cetera, et cetera. I see a trap there.
Right.
Well, I don't see the trap. Basic income means that you'll have an income of X dollars. If you choose not to work, then you should be able to live and pay the rent, have a decent roof over your head, be able to have the heat on, electricity, blah, 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 the basic requirements of at least living sustainably in our world. And if you get a job, you'll have a higher income. So people have the same incentive to work under my system as they do under the current system. And their incomes should, you know, I mean, the pay structure will be set by the market the way it is now, I expect, at least, well, like I said, I expect. So I don't really see what the problem is in having both of them. Everyone gets a basic income, but we want to give people incentives to work. I mean, look, a basic income is not going to be much, and that goes to the reciprocity thing. That's part of the reciprocity thing. You want to surf? Fine. Don't expect to live. I mean, you'll be eating hot dogs, and you'll be living, I don't know where, in a little one-bedroom apartment, but we won't let you be homeless.
Well, but what you're saying is not the market determining whether the job is available. What you're saying is that the state would guarantee that a job would be available.
Well,
there's a big difference.
most jobs would be made available just as they are now because there's a labor market which would remain the same. However, for example, we could decide as a society to pump more money into education. So instead of me teaching 40 students at a time, I could be teaching 20 students at a time, and there could be twice as many professors at my school. And I don't see the problem there, sorry.
You said, I don't know who was next. You said here, and then here in the back. Okay, here in the area.
Thank you for your dialogue. My question is, well, statement first. There's enough wealth in this world. We do need to find it. We need someone to find it. But once it's found, why are we still depending on government? Government should not be the answer. We're going to be obliged to them. Again, it's going to change from a welfare system to a UBI system empowered by the government. Is this what I'm hearing?
As for me, yeah, completely. The government, it's us. It's not something that's different from us.
We are the government, yeah.
So for me, and at least philosophically, it's us.
So the basic libertarian view, which sounds like your view, is that markets function perfectly, and the labor market is just like every market, so that if wage rates are set at the appropriate level, you'll have full employment and the labor market will clear, and that's just not right. I mean, it's incorrect. The labor market does not clear. It doesn't clear now, even though we have full employment, because we're not counting lots of unemployed people. And so given that we have a labor market which makes it impossible for people to find jobs, we have to. The government is, in a sense, us. That creates problems, we get corruption, blah, blah, blah. But the fact is that that's the only solution to involuntary unemployment that I can think of.
I do want to push back a little bit on this notion of full employment as something that is compatible with this other notion that seems to be part of your conceptualization of meaningful work. Because I think inevitably, the minute you start moving into trying to put in place a full employment program, you're inevitably going to need to have to make work, right? So create kind of jobs that aren't needed for people who aren't fitting into the jobs that you create. And I guess I'm wondering whether, even though you're saying full employment, what you really mean is just government being much more of an active government, investing in infrastructure, creating high-speed rail, doing a lot more to save the environment. I mean, there are ways of thinking about government being a much larger employer, right? So the driving force there would be, you know, all of the other social goods that we want that are more common goods, rather than making the goal, the driving kind of force, creating a job for everyone who wants one. And, you know, having been in kind of other countries where they have had full employment policies, I've worked alongside, you know, people who really kind of knew they were there only because, you know, somebody created a job for them that they were not qualified or even wanted to be doing. So I guess I don't know.
Well, Larry said that the most important force for job creation is the private market. So it only applies to a very limited percentage of the population, the most needy. Then we can, you know, a Green New Deal, for example, sounds great to me. Then you can add to that participation income, voluntary stuff, care work, whatever you want. Studying, you can include studying. So it can be very pleasant.
I don't think that we have to resort to making people dig ditches and fill them up again, as people like to say. There's lots of meaningful work that can be done. A lot of it you articulated very nicely, rebuilding the infrastructure and so on. Another one I would propose is the thing I said a few minutes ago. We could do a much better job with education and have a lot more people engaged in teaching students, which would benefit our society. And by the way, going back to the whole technology, robotics thing, at some point, it's going to be time to reduce the work week and to pay people full-time salaries for a 30-hour week instead of a 40-hour week. Keep in mind that not so long ago, people worked 60-hour weeks. And then, finally, the work week got pushed down thanks to union activity and worker uprisings to 40 hours, and it's been that way for a very long time. And so we have to we have to find a way to give people an opportunity to contribute to society, because people want to contribute to society. Most people do. For those who don't, basic income, I'm all right with it if it's not at too high of a level, but everyone should have an opportunity to contribute, and that's a huge problem in our society. But it is a very expensive fix.
It's interesting to me that the Malibu surfer metaphor is from the late 80s, and I wonder if the concern I hear more now is the dope-smoking computer game player. And I wonder, because the Malibu surfer, for all their fecklessness, is kind of a romantic image, and they're still in the outside world, they're still engaged, it's a healthy activity, and there's an aspirational element to it. But in sort of the virtual worlds we're creating now, there's a much darker element to it, and there's much more of a kind of like dropout risk at a sort of psychological level as well as a physical and social level. I'm just wondering if that has shifted any of the debates, or if it's just on a philosophical level, it's the same thing, you're dropping out.
Well, from the standpoint of the economy, there's no real difference. I'm not saying there's no difference in any sense, right? But yeah, I mean, it's people who are giving income to consume and who are not producing. And the basic idea, which I subscribe to still without putting any numbers on anything, is an economy is a system where we put into the pot and we take out of the pot. And you can make the pot as complex as you want, but it sort of comes down to that, I think. And so we want people to put into the pot and to contribute to society, we need to make sure they have an opportunity to do that. And they shouldn't be doing it for dirt poor wages. That's where the basic income, you know, I mean, if we set the right market forces into place, we wouldn't need a minimum wage law, because the labor market would be such that the supply of labor would be matched with the demand for labor. We have a terrible labor market now because of the fact that we have so many more people who would like to work than who are able to find jobs. And that's, to me, is a tragedy.
Coming.
What impact do you think having a basic income would have on minimum wage or the wage growth? I mean, I like to theorize that people could say no and then wages would have to go up because of market forces, but is there any evidence for that? Is it just philosophical, or what are your opinions on basic income versus minimum wage?
Well, the article I was citing by Alan Thomas, his argument is that basic income would create, would provoke the rise of the wages and then inflation, and then that would be bad for the poorest. So that's hypothetical. I don't know what are the economists behind, but that's the argument.
One of Karl Marx's most insightful observations is the fact that capitalism gives you an industrial reserve army and ensures that the supply of labor will exceed the demand for labor, and that's just supply and demand economics. I don't feel I need a whole lot of statistics here. You know, if the supply of labor is way above the demand for labor, then wages are going to be low. I'm sorry.
No. There's things here that I don't understand. In the golden age of Greece, they didn't even have a word for work, they used to negotiate. And the most productive time, probably in our history, was a time where they basically sat in the street, they did geometry, they speculated about the distance of the sun from the earth, and they did a pretty good job on that. And they did a lot of basic work, and that all came out of leisure. Work contributed very little.
They had slaves. They had
That
slaves
is right.
at the work.
That is right. That is right.
And
But
women.
That's right. That is right. That's how they had slaves. That's true. But the really great work was done out of leisure. Now we have also got slaves. They're called internal combustion engines, and solar power and all sorts of things. So we got all these slaves. What the hell are we bothering about work at all for? I mean, we've got to feel good about we're contributing. But the facts of the matter are that there's very, very little that's left to be done. You know, I'm a farmer. I can produce enough food for 1,000 people. You know, and it's not very difficult. And we can probably all do that sort of thing. So we've got to feel good about ourselves. So we've got to rush around and be busy. But really, there's not, what we should be doing, I think, is relaxing, settling down, get a little bit of silence into our lives, a little bit of contemplation, and try to work out, well, what really should we be doing? Not running around taking in each other's washing, but trying to discover how we can really serve each other. And, you know, what is the meaning of our lives, and how can we help each other rather better than we are now? So I think work's a bloody nonsense. We've got to put it out, and we've got to start thinking about leisure as a permanent state. And all we've got to do is support each other. Not very difficult. Not very difficult. I mean, it's just a matter of food and water.
We're just at the end of our period, so I'm going to let the panelists reply, and then we'll take a break before our last session.
Well, I don't have much of a reply except to say that it seems to me another either or that is not really an either or. Of course we should do all those things, but I don't envision living in a world where people aren't working, and I don't think I'm going to see a world where people aren't working or even want to work. And even if we could meet all of our material needs with machines doing everything, we'd still be doing things to enhance each other's lives. Rawls's phrase was a fair system of social cooperation. That's what I want. And So less work is good. That's why I said reduce the work week.
Just to go in your direction, we should be very charitable with the conception of the state as an employer. Always imagine that the best conception is precisely to allow the type of activities which allow to be creative and relaxed and happy about yourself. Once we do that, then we have a debate. State as an employer versus UBI, or, like our colleague here, both. I don't see how, in Rawlsian terms, but in reality, yes.
Join me in thanking our panelists for very stimulating